The night it happened, I was living in a rental house at the edge of Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone and nothing exciting ever occurred. The house itself was old, built sometime in the early 70s, with creaking floorboards and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. I had moved there 3 months prior for work, taking a position at the local lumber mill that paid just enough to cover rent and groceries. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I had always been comfortable with solitude, preferring the company of books and my own thoughts to the obligations of social interaction. But that night changed everything, and now I find myself afraid of silence in ways I never imagined possible. It was a Tuesday in late October when the temperature had dropped suddenly, bringing with it that particular kind of cold that seeps through walls and settles into your bones. I had gone to bed around 11 after finishing a chapter of some forgettable thriller I had picked up at the thrift store downtown. The bedroom was at the back of the house, overlooking a dense stretch of woods that extended 4 miles into the hills. Sometimes at night, I would hear animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance, but these sounds had become a familiar lullaby that helped me sleep. That night, however, the woods were silent, not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy, oppressive quiet that comes when every living thing is holding its breath, waiting for something to pass. I woke suddenly at exactly 3 in the morning, jolted from sleep by a sensation I couldn't immediately identify. My heart was already racing before my mind had fully caught up, some primal part of my brain screaming that something was wrong. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the thin curtains, casting everything in shades of gray and black. I lay perfectly still, listening intently, trying to understand what had pulled me from sleep with such urgency. For several long moments there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. Then I heard it, a sound so deliberate and unmistakable that my entire body went rigid with fear. 3 heavy knocks echoed from the front door, each one spaced exactly apart, methodical and patient. The sound carried through the empty house with a weight that seemed to press against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. Nobody in their right mind would be knocking on doors at 3 in the morning. Not in a town like Millbrook, where people were in bed by 10 and considered 9 p.m. late. My first thought was that someone needed help, that there had been an accident on the rural highway that ran past the outskirts of town. But something about those knocks felt wrong, too measured, too deliberate to be the frantic pounding of someone in distress. I forced myself to sit up, my legs feeling weak and unsteady as I swung them over the side of the bed. The old floorboards creaked under my weight, and I froze, suddenly terrified that whatever was outside would hear me moving. I waited in the darkness, straining my ears for any additional sound, any clue about who or what might be standing on my front porch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the knocking, stretching out into seconds that felt like hours. My mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. A lost hiker, a drunk neighbor, someone with car trouble, or something else entirely. Something that my rationale mind didn't want to acknowledge but that my instincts were screaming about. After what felt like an eternity, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and used its dim light to navigate through the bedroom doorway and down the narrow hallway. The house seemed different in the darkness, more confined and threatening, as if the walls had drawn closer while I slept. Every shadow became a potential hiding place, every creak of the old house a possible footstep. I moved slowly toward the living room, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. My phone held out in front of me like a talisman against the dark. The front door was visible from the end of the hallway, a solid rectangle of wood with a small window at the top covered by a decorative curtain my landlord had left behind. I stopped at the entrance to the living room, my hand gripping the doorframe so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The sensible thing would be to call out, to ask who was there and what they wanted, but something primal kept me silent, some ancient survival instinct that warned me against revealing my presence. I stood there in the darkness, barely breathing, watching the front door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness, and just when I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that I had been dreaming and the knocks had been part of some nightmare, I heard something else. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving across the wooden planks of the front porch. But these weren't normal footsteps, not the casual shuffle of someone waiting or the impatient pace of someone in a hurry. These steps had a strange rhythm to them, a gait that seemed somehow off, as if whatever was making them wasn't quite used to walking. The sound moved from the front door to the left side of the porch, then stopped directly in front of the living room window. My blood turned to ice as I realized that whatever was out there was now less than 10 feet away from me, separated only by a thin pane of glass and a curtain I had never bothered to close properly. I could see a shadow through the gap in the curtains, a dark shape that was tall enough to block out the moonlight. It stood completely still, and I had the terrible sensation that it was looking directly at me through the glass, that somehow it could see me standing frozen in the darkness of my living room. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to move, to run, to do something, but I remained unable to do anything but stare at that motionless shadow. The moment stretched into infinity, a standoff between me and whatever was on the other side of that window, each of us waiting for the other to make the first move. Then, slowly, deliberately, the shadow moved away from the window. I heard those strange footsteps again, moving around the side of the house toward the back where my bedroom was located. Panic finally broke through my paralysis, and I rushed back down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet in the darkness. I burst into my bedroom and pressed myself against the wall next to the window, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might tear through my chest. The footsteps continued around the house, circling it with that same strange, uneven rhythm. They paused at my bedroom window, and I held my breath, certain that at any moment I would see a face pressed against the glass, staring in at me. But nothing appeared. After another eternal moment, the footsteps moved on, completing their circuit of the house and returning to the front porch. I heard them climb the steps again, heard them stop at the front door, and then, once more, 3 deliberate knocks echoed through the house. This time, I didn't hesitate. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering urgently to the dispatcher that someone was outside my house, that they were trying to get in, that I needed help immediately. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, asking me questions I could barely focus on, telling me that officers were on their way and to stay on the line. The knocking stopped. The footsteps retreated down the porch steps, and then there was silence again. That same oppressive quiet that had preceded the whole nightmare. I stayed on the line with a dispatcher who kept talking to me in soothing tones, asking if I could still hear anything, if Primera is safe, if I had somewhere secure to hide. I told her I was alone, that I was in my bedroom, that everything had gone quiet. She instructed me to stay there, to keep the door locked, to wait for the officers who would be arriving in just a few minutes. Time seemed to have lost all meaning, each second crawling by with excruciating slowness. When I finally saw the red and blue lights flashing through my windows, the relief was so intense I nearly collapsed. I heard car doors slamming, heard voices outside, heard the authoritative knock of the officers identifying themselves. I stumbled to the front door on legs that barely supported my weight and opened it to find 2 sheriff's deputies, standing on my porch, their flashlights sweeping the area, hands resting on their weapons. I must have looked like hell because their expressions immediately shifted from professional alertness to concern. One of them, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, asked if I was all right, if I was injured, if the intruder was still on the property. I explained what had happened as coherently as I could manage, describing the knocks, the circling footsteps, the shadow at my window. The deputies listened carefully, exchanging glances that I couldn't quite interpret. When I finished, the older deputy asked me to stay inside while they checked the perimeter of the house. I watched from the doorway as they walked the property with their flashlights, examining the ground, the porch, the areas beneath the windows. They were out there for nearly 15 minutes before returning, and the expression on the older deputy's face made my stomach drop. He asked me to step outside for a moment, to look at something they had found. I followed them around to the side of the house, beneath my bedroom window, where the younger deputy was crouched down, shining his flashlight on the ground. There, pressed deep into the soft earth beneath my window, was a footprint. But it wasn't a normal footprint, not a boot or shoe or even a bare human foot. The print was massive, icily, 14 inches long, with claw marks at the tips of 4 distinct toes and an elongated pad at the heel. But what made my blood run cold was the shape of it, the way it was clearly designed to walk upright, like a human foot, but wrong in every fundamental way. The older deputy stood up slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his weapon again. He asked me if I had any large dogs on the property, if there were any animal sanctuaries nearby, if I had seen any wildlife around the house before tonight. I shook my head mutely, unable to tear my eyes away from that print. The deputy pulled out his phone and took several photographs, the flash illuminating the disturbing impression in stark detail. He told me that they would file a report, that they would increase patrols in the area, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, could see the confusion in his eyes when he looked at that print. They asked if I wanted them to stay until morning or if I had somewhere else I could go for the night. I told them I would stay, that I would keep all the doors and windows locked, that I would call immediately if anything else happened. They left reluctantly, the older deputy giving me his personal cell number and making me promise to use it if I felt unsafe. I watched their taillights disappear down the long driveway, and then I was alone again, standing in front of my house at 4 a.m, staring at the woods that suddenly seemed far more threatening than they ever had before. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Instead, I sat in my living room with every light in the house blazing, a baseball bat across my lap and my phone within easy reach. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the old house sent adrenaline coursing through my system. I kept replaying those moments in my mind, the methodical knocks, the strange footsteps, the shadow at my window, and most of all, that impossible footprint. As dawn finally broke and pale light began filtering through my windows, I felt some small measure of relief. Whatever had visited me in the night belonged to darkness, and surely it wouldn't return in daylight. But I was wrong about that. Over the following days, I tried to convince myself that it had been a one-time occurrence, some strange animal that had wandered out of the deep woods and would never return. I went about my daily routine, working at the mill, buying groceries, trying to act as if everything was normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At work, I would catch myself staring out the windows toward the tree line. At home, I found myself constantly checking locks, peering out windows, jumping at shadows. My coworkers noticed my distraction and exhaustion, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? The deputies had submitted their report, but when I called to follow up, they had no new information. The footprint had been documented and photographed, but nobody could or would tell me what might have made it. One of the deputies mentioned that they had sent the photos to a wildlife expert at the state university, but so far hadn't received any response. Meanwhile, I was left alone in that house, at the edge of the woods, wondering if and when my visitor might return. I started sleeping with my bedroom door barricaded, with my phone fully charged beside me, with that baseball bat always within arm's reach. 4 nights after the first incident, it came back. This time, I was still awake, sitting up in bed, reading, too anxious to sleep. It was just past 2 a.m. when I heard it, that same heavy, deliberate sound of footsteps on my front porch. My whole body went rigid, the book falling from my numb fingers as I stared at my bedroom door. The footsteps moved slowly across the porch, then down the steps, then began circling the house just as they had before. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called 911 again, whispering frantically that it was back, that the intruder had returned, that I needed help now. This time, I didn't wait passively. With the dispatcher on the line, I moved to my bedroom window and carefully pulled back the edge of the curtain. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat and my mind struggled to process the impossibility before my eyes. Standing in the moonlight at the edge of the woods was a figure, but it was like no animal I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be covered in dark fur or hair, but it was standing upright on 2 legs, its posture almost human except for a forward lean that suggested it was built for speed. As I watched, frozen in horror, it turned its head toward my window. I saw its face for only a moment before instinct made me jerk back from the glass, but that glimpse was enough to be seared into my memory forever. The head was canine, wolf-like, with a long snout and pointed ears that swiveled toward the house. But the eyes that looked at me were wrong, too intelligent, too focused, with a kind of awareness that no animal should possess. When it saw me at the window, its lips pulled back in what might have been a smile or a snarl, revealing teeth that gleamed white in the moonlight. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it vanished into the darkness of the woods. The dispatcher was asking me what I saw, if the intruder was still there, if Primeroa is safe. I struggled to form words, to describe what I had just witnessed in any way that wouldn't make me sound completely insane. Before I could even try, I heard sirens approaching in the distance, growing louder as patrol cars raced up my long driveway. This time there were 3 vehicles, and the deputies who emerged from them moved with weapons drawn, taking my report seriously in a way that suggested they knew more than they were saying. I told them what I had seen, watching their faces carefully for any sign of disbelief or mockery. But instead, I saw a grim acceptance. The older deputy from the first night, whose name I learned was Sheriff Marcus Halley, asked me to describe the creature in as much detail as possible. I did, expecting at any moment for him to tell me I was mistaken, that it had been a bear or a person in a costume. Anything that would make sense in the rational world I thought I lived in, but he just nodded slowly, as if everything I was saying confirmed something he already suspected. He told me that there had been other reports, not many and not publicized, but over the years several people had described encounters with something similar in these woods. Most had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but the reports kept coming, always from this area, always describing the same impossible thing. Sheriff Halley explained that the woods behind my property were part of a vast wilderness that had never been fully explored or mapped. There were parts of those forests that no human had walked in decades, maybe centuries, places so remote and inaccessible that anything could live there undiscovered. He told me about legends passed down by the indigenous peoples who had lived in this region long before Europeans arrived. Stories about creatures that walked like men but were not men, that hunted in the deep woods and occasionally ventured into the world of humans. Most people dismissed such stories as folklore, but he had been a lawman in this county for 30 years, and he had seen things that made him less skeptical than he once was. He suggested strongly that I consider relocating, at least temporarily. He couldn't guarantee my safety in this isolated house, not when something had already marked it, had already shown interest in me specifically. I wanted to argue, to insist that I wouldn't be driven from my home by some animal, no matter how strange or frightening. But the memory of those eyes looking at me through the window, of that too intelligent gaze fixed on me with what felt like malicious intent, made the words die in my throat. I agreed to stay somewhere else, at least until they could figure out what was happening and how to deal with it. I packed a bag that same night and drove to a motel on the other side of town, a small family-run place that felt safe simply because it was surrounded by streetlights and other people. But even there, in a locked room with the television playing and the sounds of other guests moving around nearby, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those eyes, that predatory smile. I wondered if it knew where I had gone, if it was capable of tracking me beyond the woods and the isolation of my rental house. The thought kept me awake until exhaustion finally claimed me as dawn was breaking. Days turned into a week, and I lived out of that motel room, calling in sick to work and barely leaving except to buy food and check in with Sheriff Halley. He told me that they had organized search parties, that they had brought in wildlife experts, and even some cryptozoologists who specialized in unknown animals. They found tracks throughout the woods, dozens of prints like the one beneath my window, creating a network of trails that suggested the creature had a territory that covered miles. But they never found it, never even caught a glimpse of it, as if it knew it was being hunted and was staying one step ahead of its pursuers. During that week, I spent hours researching online, falling down rabbit holes of cryptid sightings and folklore. I learned about creatures called dogmen or werewolves, reported throughout North America but especially in remote forested areas. The descriptions varied in details, but the core characteristics were always the same: bipedal caninus, massive in size, displaying intelligence beyond any known animal. Most accounts were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but as I read story after story, each one echoing my own experience in uncomfortable ways, I began to understand that there was a pattern here, something consistent enough that it couldn't all be fabrication or mass delusion. I found accounts from researchers who claimed these creatures were a previously unknown species, a missing link of some kind that had evolved to avoid human detection. Others believed they were something supernatural, beings that existed in the spaces between our understanding of reality. Some thought they were remnants of extinct megafauna that had survived in pockets of deep wilderness, while others suggested they were interdimensional beings that could move between worlds. The theories were endless and mostly absurd, but underlying all of them was a common thread. These things were real, they were dangerous, and they had been sharing our world for far longer than most people realized. On the 8th night of my self-imposed exile, Sheriff Halley called me with news. They had set up trail cameras throughout the woods behind my house, motion-activated devices that would photograph anything that passed by. One of those cameras had captured something, and he wanted me to come down to his office to look at the images. I drove there with my heart in my throat, not sure if I wanted to see proof that what I had witnessed was real, or if I would prefer to maintain some small hope that I had been mistaken, that it had all been some elaborate misunderstanding. The photos were spread across his desk when I arrived. Grainy night vision images that nonetheless showed clear details. In the first few frames, nothing was visible except trees and undergrowth. Then, in the fourth image, something emerged from the right side of the frame. It was massive and dark, moving onto legs with a posture that was unmistakably bipedal. In the next frame, it had moved closer to the camera. Its head turned slightly, so that one eye reflected the infrared light like a glowing orb. The subsequent images showed it walking past the camera, giving a full view of its profile. The wolf-like head, the powerful shoulders, the arms that were longer than human proportions but ended in something like hands. The legs that bent backward at the knee like a dog's butt supported a fully upright stance. In the final image, the creature had stopped and turned to face the camera directly, as if it knew it was being photographed and wanted to look back at whoever might be watching. Its mouth was open in what looked like a snarl or a laugh, and even in the degraded quality of the night vision image, I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the awareness that set it apart from any animal I had ever encountered. This wasn't a bear standing upright or a person in a costume. This was something else entirely, something that challenged every assumption about what was possible in the natural world. Sheriff Halley told me that the images had been sent to multiple experts, all of whom had confirmed that the photos appeared genuine and none of them could identify the species or offer an explanation for what it might be. The cryptozoologists were excited, talking about mounting an expedition to capture or at least properly document the creature. The wildlife officials were more cautious, discussing potential dangers and the need for careful planning. Meanwhile, I was left with the knowledge that this thing was real, that it was still out there, and that for whatever reason, it had chosen my house to visit that night at 3 a.m. When I asked if it was safe to return home, Sheriff Halley was honest with me. He couldn't guarantee my safety, not when they still had no understanding of the creature's behavior or intentions. The fact that it had knocked rather than trying to break in suggested some level of restraint or perhaps even curiosity rather than pure predatory behavior. But that was small comfort when I remembered those eyes looking at me through my window, when I thought about how easily something that powerful could tear through a door or smash through glass if it really wanted to get inside. He suggested I find a new place to live, somewhere in town away from the woods, somewhere with neighbors and streetlights and the safety that comes from proximity to other people. I took his advice. Within 2 weeks, I had broken my lease on the rental house, forfeiting my deposit and not caring about the financial hit. I found a small apartment above a bakery in the center of Millbrook, a place where the sounds of traffic and conversation were a constant comfort, where the sunrise meant safety and the night held no shadows deep enough to hide something impossible. I never went back to that house at the edge of the woods, never retrieved the belongings I had left behind. Someone else could deal with the furniture and books and all the mundane possessions I had accumulated. None of it was worth the risk of returning to that place. It has been 6 months now since that night when something knocked on my door at 3 a.m. I still don't sleep well, still wake at odd hours with my heart racing. Still check the locks on my windows and doors multiple times before bed. I have moved twice more since leaving Millbrook, each time choosing places that are more urban, more populated, more filled with the comforting evidence of human civilization. But I know that distance is an illusion of safety. I know that there are wild places all across this country, places where things that shouldn't exist have found ways to survive beyond our understanding. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep finally comes, I think about that creature standing at the edge of the woods, looking toward my window. I wonder what it wanted, why it chose that particular night to announce its presence. Was it curious about me? Or was I being warned? Marked as an intruder in territory it considered its own. I wonder how many others have seen similar things in similar places and stayed silent, afraid of ridicule or disbelief. I wonder how many of the missing person cases from remote areas might have explanations that nobody wants to consider. Most of all, I wonder if it ever came back after I left, if it stood on that empty porch and knocked again, waiting for an answer that never came. I wonder if it's still out there in those endless woods, watching the edges of our settlements, occasionally revealing itself to remind us that we are not alone on this planet, that there are things in the darkness that we have never conquered or understood. And I wonder if, someday, I will hear that sound again. 3 deliberate knocks in the dead of night, patient and measured, waiting for me to answer.